Hello, and welcome to this next session, AI Use Cases in RegTech. I'm your moderator, Nick Wakefield, co-founder of Regulation Asia. For those that don't know us, we're a leading news and analysis service in financial services regulation. We've been established for about 10 years now, and we obviously have reporters across the region as well as host our own events in person and online. So this session today will be focusing on real-world use cases for AI across financial services regulation. We'll touch on fraud and financial crime, look at the impact on regulatory change management. We'll find out how regulators are thinking about AI and talk about examples of use cases that they're either working on themselves or seeing across the industry. And we'll wrap up by taking out our crystal ball and thinking about what an AI future looks like in financial services. So I'm delighted to introduce my panelists for today. First up is Joachim Wuermeling, member of the executive board at Deutsche Bundesbank, the German central bank. Welcome, Joachim. We have Professor Douglas Arner, Kerry Holdings Professor in Law at the University of Hong Kong. Welcome, Douglas. We have Chye, co-founder and chief executive of Cynopsis Solutions. Welcome. And finally, we have Dr. Mara Balestrini, digital transformation lead at IDB Labs. Welcome. Welcome to you all. So before we go straight into the use cases, let's do a bit of scene setting here and think about really what's ahead of us in terms of the transformational change for AI in RegTech. Chye, you've played that kind of role as a compliance officer in the past. Now, what's going through your head when you think about AI and RegTech?
Well, thanks for that question. Can I have a quick show of hands? How many compliance officers do we have in the audience? Not many, quite a few, maybe very shy people. Depends on the time frame. In the past, as compliance officer, you wouldn't really care too much about technology. You wouldn't care about RegTech, for example. But now, RegTech is not a good to have anymore. It's a must have. So I think the mentality has shifted, but I think it's also important to bear in mind that do you actually put if you use the horse and the cart analysis, you gotta be quite careful not to put the cart in front of the horse. The horse gotta be leading the cart. And we'll discuss later on whether which one is technology, which one is regulation, right?
Okay, excellent. And Mara, obviously one of the big things that a lot of people talk about is responsible AI and obviously explainability. So perhaps you can just very briefly talk about how you're tackling that with what you're doing.
So IDB Lab is the venture arm of the Inter-American Development Bank. Our mission is to improve lives in Latin America and the Caribbean by reducing, enhancing inclusion through innovation. So a large number of the solutions that we invest in use AI. And it turns out that we cannot run the risk of investing in solutions that will have biases and create more exclusion and somehow a negative impact in the communities that we're trying to serve. And in Latin America and the Caribbean, and like in most countries in the world, there's no regulation for AI. So we had to come up with a set of tools to help entrepreneurs develop responsible AI. And we developed a tool called S3, which is a self-assessment tool. And we're using it with accelerators, incubators in the region who are using AI to develop financial inclusion solutions. But the tool helps them assess topics like data privacy, the quality of the data that they are using. You know, in many cases, data is biased, and therefore the algorithm will be replicating exponentially that bias. A classic example is credit scoring for women, for example. We don't have enough data points, and therefore the solutions go against those beneficiaries. Another issue that we are seeing, and that has an impact on financial inclusion and in RegTech in particular, is explainability. Whether the user is aware of why the algorithm is producing this or that answer. And this has huge implications because what we're seeing is that in RegTech, some solutions are black box algorithms where the user is unaware on why a certain outcome has come out, and that could lead to very bad decisions if the user is not capable of understanding whether the decision of the algorithm is right or wrong.
Okay, so let's dive into our kind of first use case, and we're going to look at the kind of topic of fraud and financial crime. Now, obviously, this is a very kind of a big area that I think a lot of people are focused on in this room today. And obviously, we've seen in the past the stories about 10, 15,000 people being hired in compliance departments within banks all over the front pages of the press. That's going to be very different in the future. So in terms of the fact that businesses, people are obviously becoming more digital in their lives, a lot more data with being able to be digested as well. Douglas, perhaps you can kind of expand on some of the conversations you're having and the work that you're kind of doing when it comes to kind of the fraud and financial crime space.
Yeah, I'm going to take sort of a broad perspective on this, because I think if we look at more or less AI in the context of both finance and compliance, we can see it's evolved really across four main areas. The first has been securities, the second has been payments, the third has been credit, and the fourth has really been around AML. But interestingly, one of the common themes we're seeing across all of these is fraud. If we think about payments, some of the best developed efforts have been in the context of, say, the major card services, where you have massive uses of AI from the standpoint of analyzing huge volumes of transactions to analyze for fraud. If we think about credit, we've seen some of the most interesting use cases from the standpoint of big tech companies using machine learning and AI across credit analytics, including to identify fraud. And if we think about from the standpoint of securities, yes, of course, we're often looking at disclosure or manipulation, but very frequently we're using this to look at fraud as well. And of course, AML has been the more recent. And I think if we look across all of these, I think the key point is that we are seeing an increasing use, particularly of a range of big data and pattern recognition techniques that may have started in one area or another, but are now evolving quickly. And I think from the standpoint of AI, not going into Gen AI, which is an entirely different subject, I think this is one of our most rapidly growing areas.
Okay, thank you, Douglas. So, Joachim, I'm sure you can't dive into specific use cases, but as a central bank, perhaps you can identify areas in which you're seeing the banks and yourselves benefiting from the use of AI in relation to fraud and financial crime risk.
Well, indeed, we as Bundesbank, and that's true for the entire Euro system, we encourage banks and financial institutions to use RegTech because it ultimately it improves significantly the compliance of bank and, of course, fraud detection, which is more in the interest of the bank and not in the interest of the supervisor. But it becomes more and more difficult to draw the line between RegTech, SupTech, AI in running the bank and so on, because AI is everywhere. So it becomes kind of a theme in various areas, and the contributions are different. There's also a very important use case for us as supervisors, because we can use AI, we can use big data also for our supervisory purposes. And what our vision is, to look a little bit ahead in the future, that we do no longer supervise banks on the basis of reports which are 3 months old and cover half a year before, and we react 3 months later, but to supervise and monitor the bank on a permanent basis in a real-time area where artificial intelligence subtechs produce alerts to the supervisors, and they can react on a day-to-day basis. So supervision becomes much more proactive, can react immediately and prevent more damage.
And that's the dream, obviously, isn't it? So how close are we to that? In reality,
we are heading to it. The first barrier, of course, is the data. The data is much fragmented in the big eurozone among the banks. But what we have started to work on is a book where the data points are defined, which is standardized, where we in a later stage as supervisors can rely on that in a specific data point is the same information in one bank where it is in the other bank. So it's really hard work. It's a long-term program, but the progress we can achieve is super.
Fantastic. So from Germany and Europe to Latin America, Mara, it would be great to perhaps hear about some of the initiatives that are going on there in terms of the kind of maybe digital KYC and in the financial crime space from your perspective.
Yeah, so, well, in our portfolio, we have a number of RegTechs. Every year at IDB Lab, we invest in 100 million in roughly 85 projects. And we have had some very famous ones like VU Security, for example. This is a company from Argentina that has been using artificial intelligence for identity, for fraud detection, and so on. It's pretty huge now. It's in many countries. And then there's this other one that it's very interesting called Tradle. And Tradle began using blockchain, which to me it's super interesting when we talk about embedded supervision and regulation, which we can talk later. So Tradle uses DLTs, distributed ledger technologies, is part of our blockchain initiative, which is our blockchain initiative. And one interesting thing that it does is that the ownership of the documents that are used to identify the user and other things remain with the user. So the Tradle uses a chatbot, which they created before OpenAI, and it's been incredibly enhanced with ChatGPT. And the chatbot is this conversational interface that conducts all the process of identity check, anti-money laundering processes. And through the conversation, it collects the documentation, it does the profiling, it provides an answer, and so on. And it's expanding beyond fintech and going into government services and so on, which is something that we're going to see, because the moment you couple identity with payments and other things, and we'll be seeing these combos of products embedded way beyond banking and into a whole bunch of other services. So we're looking closely at that as it goes beyond RegTech and into basically every aspect of financial inclusion and government services.
Absolutely. So, Chye, obviously your role now in a solution provider, what are some of the benefits that you're seeing in the kind of fin crime space?
I think, as said by the other panelists here, I think one of the key things that people or compliance professionals or regulated entities, be it the very big banks or the long tail of the regulated sectors, we do need to think about whether the whole spectrum of requirements that needs to be complied with in the space of know your customers in general, right? Which starts from onboarding to continuous provision of the services, because you need to have ongoing due diligence, and then on towards the transaction monitoring space. So if you break it up into the three different buckets, right? Onboarding, the workflow of the KYC and or KYB, whatever you call it, and then on to transaction monitoring. And the applications of AI in each of these verticals is massive, to the extent that you may not even realize. Like a very simple thing like OCR, optical character recognition itself is a form of artificial intelligence that is pretty mature. So that itself is usually used in the digital onboarding space, right? And then you couple that with public infrastructures like digital identity providers or even corporate registries providers, then that enriches the whole experience on the onboarding side of things. Then you go on to a little bit further to, let's say, liveness tests, right? That's pretty ubiquitous everywhere. Face compare, picture comparison, those are very, very standard. Then you move on to what is actually quite important in the whole spectrum is actually risk assessment, risk profiling, taking a risk-based approach. So the risk algorithm itself, AI application can go in there as well. Then moving on to transaction monitoring, and you talk about fraud detection. Fraud is one part, but anti-money laundering is slightly different, right? Because it actually looks for a series of patterns of behaviors that on its own, it may not be a bad transaction, but if you look at a series of transactions, it may be bad. And then you move up to a more holistic level at the regulator's perspective, is looking at the whole sector, whereas the regulated entities looks at their own platform, right? So they don't see beyond that. So there's a lot of applications around name dispositions, getting the right sort of alerts that comes out on transaction monitoring. So each of these verticals can have massive applications on AI, and we haven't even talked about Gen AI yet.
Absolutely. So I want to move on to our kind of second use case and look specifically at the kind of the regulatory angle, just in terms of how regulators can apply AI in the context of data collection, monitoring, analysis, and also ensuring there's a seamless compliance process, reducing cost of compliance, obviously, and ensuring firms' processes are robust, effective, and ultimately reducing kind of risk in the system. So we're obviously very delighted to have a regulator here today, a central bank, and perhaps Joachim, you can talk to some of the areas that the Deutsche Bundesbank are kind of exploring. You will obviously look at the AI through a different lens, perhaps, to the rest of the market, and you want to, obviously, at the same time, want to make sure that it's in lockstep as well. So perhaps you can kind of talk a little bit about some of the areas there.
Well, indeed, AI offers a lot of use cases also for the supervisor. Well, we as Bundesbank, we oversee 1,500 banks, some of the banks very local. We cannot monitor all the media in all the regions, in all the areas in Germany to find out whether there is some incident which is relevant for the supervisors. So we do that by text recognition, by sentiment analysis. So we get hints from the AI where we should look at. But there are, of course, lots of other areas which are more in the analytical space. The Eurozone is very big. There's a single supervisor for the entire Eurozone. And here we can draw a lot of pattern recognition. So if we compare all the 3,500 banks, the behavior of the running of 3,500 banks in Europe at the same time, and can see, oh, there is a bank in Malta, there's a bank in Portugal and Germany, which is doing completely different than the others. Supervisors can look at it, and we can use AI and also train the machine to identify the relevant patterns for the supervisor. So in particular, in big regulatory areas, AI allows to really take advantage from the big data which is in the banks.
So Douglas, I mean, in your role at the moment, you as well have a lot of exposure and probably work and talk to a lot of the regulators across the region. Perhaps you can expand a bit upon what Joachim was kind of discussing.
Yeah, I think 2 points that I want to hit on. One thing that we're seeing really globally across central banks and financial regulators are basically digital transformation processes. Central banks and regulators collect vast amounts of information. They need to have internal systems to manage that information. As they digitize those systems, they begin thinking about how they can use a variety of analytics, including various forms of AI, from the standpoint of the information that they have. And really, the next stage is from the standpoint of taking in information. And so we're seeing an increasing move towards digital regulatory reporting requirements, which basically draw in information in the form that central banks and supervisors need in order to be able to apply analytics. And I think really the last part of this is actually from the standpoint of the information they collect. Analytics models actually suggest you need this additional form of information, which may drive the actual setting of new reporting requirements going forward in order to collect the pieces of data that are necessary from the standpoint of running the analytics models. And I think we're seeing this both across central banks, but also particularly from the standpoint of securities markets and securities regulators.
Okay, excellent. And any other kind of comments to, I mean, Mara or Chye, do you have digital regulatory reporting? Is that, for example, something that you are investing or kind of exploring at all?
Of course, there's so much that you could do with the technologies that we have, with AI and with data. And of course, the dream is to be able to have real-time compliance checkups and embedded supervision and so on. But then the truth is that for most of the banks, the existing old banks, the data that we have is the result of a process, and it's not data that was collected with the aim of creating an automatic big data system. So the data is really bad. It's pretty bad, the quality of the data. And we're far away from having shared, and we are in the process of building, and it is the process of digital transformation of banking that is required so that we have shared taxonomies and that data starts to be collected so that it can be used for these processes. Now we are we have so many legacy systems and legacy data that make it really, really hard for us to be able to deploy these systems in a way that you can trust the result is accurate based on the data that you know you fed the system. And I think this is an observation that it's important to be had, because there are so many things that we could do, but the truth is that we have legacy systems in most banks.
May I make a point here? And that is maybe a big difference in the use of big data in companies for marketing purposes or whatsoever. Here we are in statistics, we are in supervision, so we cannot rely our decisions on unstructured data. And that is exactly what's going on. We are trying to, and well, it may be kind of surprising that the sum of the data in the bank is as big data source unstructured, because it's so differently collected within the banks. So what we need to do is to make this unstructured data structured data, but then we can base our analyze on it. And this is exactly the objective of the reporting framework we are developing in Europe. So you have really a book where you can see what number to put in that box.
Can I add a perspective here? Because I think the conversation has been great suggestions, and the conversation has been around banks, right? And we know that the financial sector comprises not just the banks, the whole spectrum of other financial services providers as well. And not everybody have got the ability and capability and the resources and the technical know-how to cleanse data in a manner in which the regulator or the supervisor wants or requires, right? And that against, to your point earlier on, Nick, cost of compliance. And this will add on to the cost of compliance for the smaller players in the sector. And that can be a big challenge, because we talk about using RegTech or AI solutions to counter financial crime. Going back to the first use case, you got to think about whether the ends that you're trying to achieve and the means that you're getting to the ends, does it justify the outcome itself? In a lot of times for the smaller players, it may not justify in terms of the cost of operation versus the cost of compliance. And from a criminal's perspective, they will then, if you know that the larger banks are onto the sexy solutions or the technologies, then they just move their operations into the less sophisticated providers and still get the same outcome, like money remittances, the platforms, and all that, to be able to get to their outcome of laundering money, for example. So I think there is like two sides to the coins.
Yeah, it's a very good observation, I think. But it's a collective kind of effort, isn't it, across the industry? And there's obviously events like this are very good at bringing everyone together to have those conversations and not just be focused on the very large banks. Joachim?
Yeah, I just said another challenge, and that is that the data from banks, but also from other institutions, are not only collected for supervisory purposes, but also for statistical purposes or for resolution purposes. And what we are dreaming of is a system where the data is collected once for all the three purposes, to make the system more efficient and also to allow the small and medium-sized entities to comply with these requirements on an efficient basis.
Okay, so I want to bring us around to our kind of the third of three kind of use cases, and that's really around regulatory change management. I think a lot about this in terms of how do institutions automate and use AI to kind of ingest those regulatory updates? How do they understand it? How do they map it to processes within their business, etc.? Chye, what are some of the examples perhaps you're seeing in this area where AI is being used?
I think this is where Gen AI comes into the picture. Because for a very long time, the challenge of a compliance officer in large organizations or banks is to keep up to speed with all the huge number of regulations at any one point in time, not even the change itself, right? Up to speed. If you are operating a compliance function across 10 different jurisdictions, then that multiplies the problem 10 times. So that itself, with Gen AI, you can actually use or collect or put all these the regulatory requirements, unstructured manner, as well as your own internal policies, whatever that is relevant for that purpose you want to comply, and then put it onto be it ChatGPT or any of the Gen AI models, and run the query from there. And it can actually it doesn't really necessarily immediately replace the compliance person's job, but it will hugely revolutionize the compliance value add to the organization. Massive, right? Because you can actually ask a question and the large language model can actually tromp through huge amount of data, your internal policies, your regulatory requirements, and come up with sensible answers for you without emotions, so to speak. Because a lot of times when a question is asked to the compliance officer, depending on his or her own risk appetite, the answer may differ, right? But with this AI, Gen AI, the answers is always going to be consistent, objective. And it can actually be a massive change to the way compliance advisory services is provided in the future.
As long as there's no bias in the original kind of, building of the AI in the first place. So, Douglas, some points to add to that?
I think Chye has made one big point, and that is when we think about Gen AI, one of the most powerful things that you can use it for is a way of interacting with data sets that were previously difficult to interact with. In other words, if you want to take your internal email system and ask it questions, that is a very useful approach from the standpoint of gaining insights from that data, but also for looking for potential issues. And it's interesting that what we're seeing from the standpoint of certain use cases is financial institutions. The thing about Gen AI is you can give it a limited data set so that it only can answer on the basis of that data set. And where this can be particularly useful is in the context of summaries of very large consultation papers or very large new regulations. And so reports about certain large financial institutions using these sorts of systems to compare, say, the implementation of Basel capital standards across multiple jurisdictions to try to identify differences in the implementation of those generally harmonized standards in different jurisdictions to try to identify areas where they need to focus from the standpoint of their own internal system design.
Well, that I would feel very sorry about if AI can be used to optimize arbitrage between the jurisdictions. So here we need to step up our harmonized efforts to make that impossible. But I wanted to say that first of all, I feel a little bit sorry about the fact that obviously the system has become so complicated, the regulatory system, that you need AI to identify the issues. We as regulators would expect from the supervised identities that they are aware of the regulatory requirements, even without using ChatGPT to identify their issues. But on the other hand, there are, of course, important use cases, in particular when it comes to new regulation, which is in Europe a difficult thing because it comes from various bodies. It comes from the European Union. It comes from the European Banking Authority. It becomes from the European Central Bank and from the national supervisors. Here, I think it's indeed can be useful because not everybody is affected by the same regulation, and you can train the machine so that you only communicate it with the information you need.
Okay, so we've got about 5 minutes left. We started the session talking about kind of the mindset and overhaul of compliance departments with regards to onboarding AI. AI is obviously very real. It's happening across RegTech, and we've gone through quite a few examples here. But I really want to look into that future. Bring that crystal ball out now. We've talked some examples of the future, but I really want to look kind of like maybe 5 years in the future. Is that too far? Because it's happening so quickly. Maybe we should be thinking what's going to happen in the next 12 months across AI. So Douglas, perhaps you want to kind of go first in terms of, what are we going to see in 12 months' time or 24 months' time in terms of AI in RegTech?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really important to recognize that in many ways, the sort of ChatGPT, Gen AI moment is likely to be a major inflection point from the standpoint of how we deal with many things. It's so easy to access and use and makes so many different forms of information easily accessible that it's very difficult to sort of imagine the way that it changes everything. But I think there is going to be certainly over the next 12 months a real struggle in the industry and in regulatory organizations about how are you going to deal with it. And what I mean by that is quite a lot of large financial institutions are banning the use by employees for a range of functions. But the reality is it's almost impossible to police. And from the standpoint of regulators, if you really want to say from the standpoint of building reports, you can't do this, there's no way you'll know. And so as a result, it's something that I think because, and we're grappling with this in the education industry, because of the ease of access and the impossibility of detection, it makes it very difficult to figure out how to limit its use, but also how to maximize the training to gain the real benefits out of it.
Mara.
Yeah, well, everything that can, well, the impact of generative AI in machine learning is going to be so huge that everything that can be automated will be automated. Everything that can be automated will be automated. And the problem is that we won't have enough time to develop the skills to apply the surveillance that is necessary to ensure that automatic decisions are fair. So we have to be very careful because there are embedded biases in all the data sets that we have. And what I see is that the time that is needed for humans to ingest all this change, to adapt to it, and to, the key question here is who is going to supervise the automated supervisors? And whether we have the skills and the time to implement that.
Okay, and Chye?
I think, as I said earlier on, Gen AI will obviously change the way compliance officers work, but one big problem is accountability and responsibility. Now, who takes the accountability? So if the regulatory advice from the ChatGPT is wrong and is relied upon, who goes to jail, right? So who's accountable? So that the aspect of it becomes a big. But of course, even from a Singapore's perspective, MAS issued the FEED framework, right? Accountability is always one of the aspect of the framework that is essential for the use of AI. So I think that will be something that is very interesting to see how it develops. But using AI as a form of co-pilot for compliance officer in terms of use of RegTech is something that I believe is not optional. It's more like a must-have rather than a good-to-have in the future.
Okay, and Joachim, final word to you.
Well, I suggest that we are now in the middle of the hype of all this, also in compliance and RegTech, and I expect that we will see some incidents. You alluded to that in the next years, which will probably diminish the hype a little bit. And my hope is that we come to the final conclusion. That would be really a nice message from the Singapore FinTech Festival, that finally it's the human being who decides and who has to take the responsibility, and that AI is only a tool.
Absolutely. I think one of the terms that I was reading about, obviously the term human in the loop, which I think obviously is very important here. I think we're all nodding our heads on that, so I'm pleased I'm kind of right with that. So we finished the session there. Just a fun fact for you all, that was completely written by AI, but of course it wasn't. So I'd like to thank very much our panelists for today, Douglas, Mara, Chye and Joachim. Thank you very much. And if you want to catch any of the stories from today, you can obviously catch us on regulationasia.com as well. Thank you for joining us.